Hi, everyone, and welcome to Electric Vehicles for Apartments. This is part 2 of 2 webinars in a series that's being sponsored and run by City of Canada Bay. It was initially kicked off by Jane Peacock, who's actually just moved on to a new role, and Belinda Coates is the person from council who is responsible for sponsoring this webinar tonight. She may join us, but we'll just get into it at this point in time. So here are Belinda Coates's details. She's the manager for sustainability and waste with the City of Canada Bay. So thanks for joining us for this EV charging deep dive in strata. So the previous webinar that we did with City of Canada Bay was really focused on the case for EV charging and helping strata committees build the momentum and try and start the process of mobilizing people from a social perspective inside the apartment buildings on this journey towards EV charging. Tonight, in the second webinar, we'll actually go a little bit more into the technical side of EV charging in strata apartment buildings. We're going to look at a bunch of models of how it's been implemented in different strata apartment buildings in Sydney. And we'll also look at some case studies, and we'll talk through technologies such as Wi-Fi, load balancing, etc., still coming from the perspective of the owner's corporation or your strata community, rather than coming from the perspective of the end user. So we've got a bunch of contents here. You can see we'll be working through this over the next hour. We just ask that if you've got any questions, you put them into the chat, and then we'll have some time for dealing with the questions after the formal part of the presentation. So let's start off. There are a couple of prerequisite projects before you go about doing EV charging installation inside your apartment building. So a number of buildings are running a survey first to gauge the interest, and the benefit of running one of these surveys inside your apartment building is it actually helps when it comes to laying out the roadmap and how aggressive you're going to be in deploying what technologies over the coming years. So basically, the more people that are in favor right now, the more aggressive you can push the roadmap for technology inside the building. A second thing is understanding your maximum load. You can go about this through getting a feasibility study from a consultancy. You can also go about installing a permanent electricity monitoring device into the building. And there are a number of different electricity monitoring devices that can be purchased in the market. One good thing is if you can actually get one of these devices that independently hooks onto the main incomers into the building and is not reliant on the common area meter, then that can give you the aggregate load of everything coming into the building, not just the load on the common area meter. And a bunch of strata buildings that have prepared have installed multiple electricity monitoring devices. One building we'll look at later on has 3 of them installed into the building. And you can have them on the main incomers, which is the aggregate load of the common areas and all the apartments. You can also put them on the common area meter, and you can put them on the electric vehicle charging circuits or distribution boards for electric vehicle charging as well. In some cases, you may have to invest into an electrical infrastructure upgrade that might be increasing the capacity into the building from the nearest substation. We urge everyone to try and go for as long as they can before going into one of those projects, because that's a level of magnitude of expense that is very high for most strata schemes to look into. And then you also have the bylaws and the policies around EV charging in your building. And we will come to that after we've had a look at some of the technical models today. So just so we know where we're going, we'll first look at the future of EV charging in buildings. So some of the things that we'll be looking out for are Open Charge Point Protocol. This is a global industry standard for interoperability between charge points from different manufacturers. And that interoperability can include not only interoperability for billing, but interoperability for also load management. And in future versions of the protocol, it may include things like booking systems for say, visitor car parking spaces, etc. as well. But so Open Charge Point Protocol, that's the industry standard that we're working towards. EV car share, we can see on the right, a picture from EQ Tower in Melbourne that has 2 electric vehicles on car share dedicated to people inside the apartment building only. It's not for access from people that are outside the building. Another technology is the vehicle to grid. So that's bidirectional flow of electricity in and out of the battery in the electric vehicle. Still very expensive at this stage. The charge points for vehicle to grid are about $10,000 each. So there's not a compelling business case for vehicle to grid in strata buildings until the cost of those charge points comes down into line with the charge points, the smart chargers you can buy in the market. And then solar and battery powered EV charging in the strata scheme, so that we're actually lowering the cost of filling the tanks of the electric vehicles and lowering the cost per kilometre. Now, just a couple of things we'll mention. Here's an article that was in the paper recently. It featured a tenant who had an electric vehicle. There was a pillar right next to his car parking space that had a general power outlet on it, and the owners corporation wasn't fully informed and gave the wrong advice to this tenant and said, you need to speak to your owner and get your owner to get a bylaw passed to allow you to use that general power outlet that's right next to your electric vehicle car parking space. The tenant offered to pay $10 a week to more than cover the cost of the charging of the general power outlet. The owners corporation, being ill-informed, made the wrong decision and went and decommissioned the general power outlet that he was using to charge to stop him from charging. So then he went and sold his vehicle and went back to an internal combustion engine vehicle. So we'll just cover off what went wrong here, which was really just a failure of knowledge and information. And we'll cover how you actually didn't need a bylaw to be passed and no strata legal fees needed to be involved in order to allow a tenant to use a general power outlet in the car parking space. Also, it's been covered in the financial review, resistance to EV charging as a power game in strata. And if we go overseas, we go to Canada. In Vancouver, you've got a strata, who was taken to court, and the strata actually won in a civil case against the owner there. So obviously, there's been a little bit of contentious. There've been some contentious issues around EV charging. Now, we're going to look through some different scenarios here. Keep in mind that you might have joined this webinar and you'll be looking at this webinar from the perspective of your own strata building. But in New South Wales, a strata building can be a townhouse or villa complex. It can be low rise, medium rise, high rise. It can be a precinct that's a combination of townhouses and medium rise or high rise. It can also be converted warehouses. It can be old commercial buildings converted to residential. So bear in mind, we're going to talk about some scenarios that are not relevant to your building, but we're trying to cater to everyone who might join this webinar. And so we're trying to cater to the field. Basically, you can see a table here that has the strata size in lots. And the key takeaway is that strata buildings in New South Wales that have more than 100 units in them is less than 1% of the market. So as a rough rule of thumb, depending on the size of the strata building that you're coming from, if you're in a strata complex of 1 to 10 lots, you might be focused more on scenarios 1 to 6 that we're going to cover. If you're in a strata of lots 11 to 100, you might be more focused on scenarios 4 to 7. And if you're in like a very large strata, you might be more focused on scenarios 4 to 9. Okay. So first of all, scenario number 1, using a general power outlet in the visitor car parking spaces, connected to a common area meter to charge EVs. For example, this is a model that I'm currently borrowing an electric vehicle. I'm using this model in my strata building of 40 apartments, and I've got an end user agreement with the building. That means I record the kilowatt hours of each charging session, and then each quarter I pay an amount back to the owners corporation to reimburse them for the electricity which I consume from a power point that sits behind one of the visitor car parking spaces. So the key things from a technical perspective to keep in mind, the power points that you've currently got in car park areas in strata are typically for vacuum cleaners, or cleaning the car park, or vacuum cleaners for cleaning cars, or vacuum cleaners for cleaning the car park, or some other tools. They're usually on a lighting circuit. Each of those circuits, you can probably only have 2 electric vehicles per lighting circuit charging, and that charging will be like a 10 amp charging speed, which will give you about 12 kilometers of range per hour. But to give you an idea, you can sit an electric vehicle on one of these power points that's existing in the car park, let it sit there for 24 hours, and you might fill up 2/3 of your battery. So that's model number 1. It doesn't cost anything. You can download off the internet an example of an end user agreement that can be signed between either a tenant or an owner occupier with the owners corporation. It doesn't require a bylaw to be passed in any way, because you're not making any physical change to the building. But there's a little bit of trust or an honor system involved in using this. And of course, where there's trust or honor, that can be abused. So power outlets, examples, here we've got a mobility device that's charging off a general power outlet in a strata car park. Here you've got an electric vehicle. Here you've got a motorbike that is using a trickle charge as well. Okay, so now scenario number 2, using a general power outlet in an individual lot cage or garage. So remember, some of our older strata schemes have the lift up garage on the ground floor of the strata building, and then all the apartments are above that in the red brick, white brick model from the 60s and the 70s. So you might have a private garage area. There might be a power point in each of those garages already, and that is more than likely connected to the common area meter in most cases. And again, you can use that same method of plugging the electric vehicle in through the charging cable that comes with every electric vehicle that can plug into a 3-prong power outlet. Just to let you know, there are a couple of strata schemes that are considering where they've got the lift up garages on the ground floor, running a brand new circuit to each of the garages to install new power outlets. And if you were to do that sort of project, if, for example, you've only got a couple of, what does happen in strata is sometimes not every lift up garage or cage inside a basement car park has a general power outlet. Some do and some don't. If you're going to go to the expense of running new circuits into each of those areas, then you could look at adding a new apartment distribution board, which then maps those new general power outlets back onto the individual apartment meters, which would avert the need to put in place those cost recovery mechanisms. So that has been considered in some of the red brick, white brick walk-ups, but I actually haven't seen it implemented yet in Sydney. So just jump over to Milson's point. Here's an example of quite a large strata building with a lot of general power outlets, just in cages on pylons throughout the car park area. Here's an example of actually plugging in a device that you can buy from your hardware store into the existing general power outlet. This device costs about $25, and it just measures the kilowatt hours that go through it for the charging sessions. Obviously, there's some honesty and involved in this, that device is plugged in, but contractually that can be managed. So the contract is, if you're going to use a general power outlet with that individual, in this case, Hyundai Kona owner, the contract is that every time you charge it off a general power outlet connected to the common area or house lights meter, you must plug in this device and record the kilowatt hours. But alternatively, some of the high-end vehicles have mobile phone apps that actually show you the kilowatt hours of each charging session on a mobile phone app, or via a third-party mobile phone app that connects to the car. And then you've got the charging logs there recorded on a mobile phone app, which is even simpler than using one of these devices. So we'll move on to Model 3. So we're still in the context where you might have lift-up garages for each individual lot, or you've got an underground car park where you've got separate cages that are properly caged with garage doors in the underground car park area. And in some of these, they actually have been strung up, particularly like the more modern buildings that have the separate car park cages. Some of them actually do have power points that are connected back to the private apartment meter in those cages. And in that case, there's no need for any billing or cost recovery because any kilowatt hours that are consumed are going back onto the individual apartment meter. But the one thing that you do need to consider is, particularly if you've got 2 electric vehicles and a double car space in a car park cage, you wouldn't be able to charge 2 electric vehicles and run an air conditioner and run, say, an oven and a dishwasher and a dryer at the same time on the circuit for an individual apartment, which might be somewhere between 40 amp to 63 amps total for that individual apartment. You can imagine you can't be doing a lot else on that circuit if you're charging at, say, single phase 32 amps with an electric vehicle. But this is actually the problem of the individual owner to manage, that they don't trip their own breaker on their own apartment. But if you had a number of people, for example, just say you had 3 individual apartments that were all on the same phase on a meter board of, say, 9 apartments, and you just happen to have 3 electric vehicles charging on 3 different individual lot apartment meters that were all on the same phase, you might overload that phase on the apartment distribution board. So you would need to be looking at some way of putting in load balancing equipment, or putting in timers that actually stop particular power outlets in cages from charging simultaneously. So another scenario that's been considered is using really simple basic technology of timers that are put in line above the general power outlets, and then you're actually breaking up, say, the charging time between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. And just using a very basic mechanism to have a timer that's manually set to only charge through different hours to not overload a particular circuit that might have multiple electric vehicles on it. So that's something that has been considered as well inside strata buildings. And here's an example of a townhouse complex in North Sydney. You've got these double cages in the underground car park for each of the townhouses, and they've got a power outlet in there which does connect to their own individual townhouse meter. And then this is the example of the charging cable for the electric vehicle, just plugging into that. Now let's look at scenario 4. So here we're looking at using a charge point in a visited car parking space. So here we're talking about a charge point, like a level, what we would call a level 2 charge point that we covered in the previous webinar. So imagine something such as a Tesla destination charger. But there are many brands. We showed 20 different brands of chargers in the previous webinar. So this is using a charge point in a visitor car parking space to charge an electric vehicle with billing via either a smartphone app or an RFID card. So a key thing to think about in this scenario is if you're a strata scheme that's passed a bylaw and agreed to install some level 2 charge points into one or more visitor car parking spaces, do you have 3G or 4G mobile phone reception at that visitor car space? Very important, because that'll dictate whether you can use smartphones where you put your credit card's number into the smartphone in order to charge the user for each charging session, or whether you need to look at an RFID solution where you'll actually tap an RFID card onto the charge point, to enable and finish each charging session. So there are charge points in the market now that allow you to use RFID cards which are already in your wallet. An example being the Opal card that we all have for public transport. That's an RFID card. You actually can teach a charge point to know that that is the RFID card that you're going to use for accessing and authenticating your billing. And then in a mobile phone or a website, you're connecting that RFID card that you already have to your credit card. And then you're giving permission to someone to bill that credit card each time you tap the Opal card. So the important thing there is you might be tapping your Opal card. The payment's not coming off the Opal card. The charge point's it's just learned one time that Opal card is connected to this user, and this user has this credit card, and the means of tapping that Opal card, it's not using payment off your Opal. It's actually just a means of authenticating and allowing payment to come from your credit card through a cloud-based software system. So that's a method of being able to cost recover for each charging session when those level 2 charge points are installed on a in a visitor car parking space connected back to a common area meter. Okay, so here's an example in Darlinghurst. You've got two of these, visitor spots. They've actually got bollards as well. They've got booking systems. So you book ahead to use either of those, and you pay with credit card. The charge point's just behind the column there. Now, scenario 5, using a charge point in individual lot car spaces connected to an individual apartment meter located in the car park area. So in some of our strata buildings, there will be times where all the individual apartment meters are actually in either cabinets or meter rooms located adjacent to the car parking area. So yes, there are examples in Sydney where people have just run conduit. They've installed level 2 charge points near their car parking space, and they've paid for the running of conduit back to a meter board or a meter room that's in the car, physically located on the car park level and connected onto their individual private meter. There are scenarios in Sydney where people have their apartment meters on different floors of the building, as high as 7 floors up from the basement car park, and people have paid an electrician to run a new cable from the 7th floor down to their car spot in the basement car park. Let me just warn you, this is not really recommended, because in strata buildings, you've got the fire compliance issue, and anytime you run a cable from the living areas of the building into a car park area, you actually have to fire reseal and then get a second company to certify the fire resealing and the retardant around those cables on every floor that you pass through on the way down to the basement car park, and then from the living areas into the car park area. So this, as well as being extraordinarily expensive for the individual owner to do it, might be something that your strata scheme actually just rules out entirely for anyone to do. But the case where you have the meters located adjacent to the basement car park, which does occur from time to time in our strata buildings, then you don't have this same fire resealing and certification issue going on, because you're not passing, from into the living areas, which is that fire compliance zone. So when you're in the basement car parks of our strata buildings, typically there's not fire sealing between the different levels of the basement car park. So you can actually drill holes through slabs between one level of a basement car park and another, and not have to have that recertified, because that's not a fire compliance zone that you would hit once you're going through the living areas of the apartment building. So here's an example in Piermont where the meters were in meter rooms adjacent to the car park on the same level as where the cars were parked. So charge point on the wall, conduit along the roof going to the meter room, and then a breaker for the individual apartment meter in that meter room to allow the charging. And of course, that's just coming off the individual apartment meter, so no need for cost recovery there. Now, scenario number 6. This is using, say, a level 2 charge point in an individual lot car space connected via a cable tray and a house distribution board to a common meter to charge the electric vehicle. And in this case, we also have a data cable that connects the charge point to a network box for billing purposes and hardware load balancing purposes. So in this case, we've got 2 cables going to each of the level 2 charge points. We've got a power cable that goes this way through a cable tray on the roof to a distribution board where it connects to a pole. And then ultimately this distribution board connects back to the common area meter. You also have this data cable that physically runs along the side of the building and goes into a network connection box to connect to comms equipment that might sit in a comms room. And then that comms equipment throws the data, the billing data up into the cloud to allow cost recovery for the owners corporation, and data can move back down the data cable down this way to control the charge point and say slow down or speed up or schedule, turn on or off the charging, depending on what other activities happening in the building to not overload the building, or depending on how many vehicles are charging at that same time. So here's an example of cable tray in Erskineville passing every car space that's been installed. And so the cable can run along this cable tray that's hanging off the roof, and then charge points, can be installed on, say, pylons or bollards through the car park area. Okay, let's have a look at scenario number 7. So this is using a charge point, a level 2 charge point in an individual lot car space connected via a cable tray and a house distribution board to the common area meter to charge the electric vehicle. However, in this case, we're using Wi-Fi for data connectivity for billing, software load balancing, and also software updates into the electric vehicles themselves. So as you know, vehicles such as Tesla, Mercedes, Volkswagen, and others, the vehicles themselves are like your mobile phone. They download updates into the phones. These vehicles download updates into their vehicles. So they're using the Wi-Fi network for updating the software in the car, and those updates can come down every week or so. So the difference here is instead of running data cables along the side of the basement car park back to the comms room, you're using the Wi-Fi network. So this is like a virtual network. So you've got Wi-Fi repeaters set up at intervals, maybe every 25 meters through the basement car park, providing a Wi-Fi network that's managed by the owners corporation. And then under this scenario, then you only have one physical cable coming into the level 2 charge point. You don't have two cables that we saw in the previous model, which was scenario 6. So the communications between the charge points is via Wi-Fi, and that can be used for billing purposes and cost recovery. It can be used for load balancing to not overload the building. And in the case of some modern charge points like the Tesla Generation 3 charger, the Wi-Fi can actually be used to update the software that's inside the charge point, the level 2 charge point. So we've had this concept of Wi-Fi updating the software in the electric vehicles. Now we've also got this concept of Wi-Fi being used to update the software into the actual charge points themselves. And the difference there is you save on, say, technician fees for attending the building to install firmware updates into charge points that are physically installed into the building. So let's move on. First, here we are in the Sydney CBD, just off Hyde Park, electric vehicle, charge point on the wall isolator, cable tray, back to a distribution board that's located in the car park area. And you can see it says Tesla charger for the lot number on that breaker there. Okay, scenario number 8. We're using a charge point in an individual lot car space connected via a flat cable and a distribution board to common property meter to charge the EV. We still have data cables in this scenario, which connect the level 2 charge points to a network box for billing and hardware load balancing purposes. So the key difference we've got in this model is we're using something called a flat cable instead of a cable tray with individual cable lines for each individual charge point, we're using one flat cable that will have multiple charge points connected to it. Now, this scenario probably looks better after we've seen a picture of the flat cable. A picture tells 1,000 words. Here is a flat cable, also called a bus duct or a bar or a busway, running along the perimeter of the basement car park. And over time, you chop that and add charge points into that existing flat cable. So you run the cable once, add the charge points multiple times. So that's an alternative to using the cable tray that hangs off the roof of the building. Looks a little bit more premium, looks a little bit more high-end than running cable tray through the basement car park area. And then we get to scenario 9, and this is our last one. So this is the model where we're using a charge point, level 2 charge points in individual locked car spaces, connected via flat cable, and distribution board connected to common property meter to charge the EV. But we're back using the Wi-Fi for data connectivity, for billing software and load balancing, and software updates into the EV. So this is like the model we saw earlier. There's no hard wires for data connectivity into the charge points. You're using Wi-Fi on this side, and you're using the flat cable for power to the charge points. So that brings us to the Zinc building at Alexandria. So this is a building that's implemented the flat cable in Sydney. They've got these Tesla Generation 3 charge points connected off the flat cable, and they've taken it one step further. They've got a common area solar system on the roof that actually can flow down and feed through these Tesla charge points into the electric vehicles. So let's just work through. We saw one of the concepts that we saw in the 9 scenarios there was going cable tray or going the flat cable. Now, even when you use cable tray, remember you're still running a separate cable or conduit to each individual electric vehicle charger. Now, let's just look at this scenario here. Imagine all these vehicles were electric vehicles. Now, if we're using cable tray or we're using conduit, then we're running a separate wire to the charge point for each of these vehicles throughout the car park area. And this basically means over time, you end up with more and more spaghetti of wires and cables on the roof of the car park. So this is an example. We got, 6 electric vehicles. They've all got their conduit running to their charge point for their individual space. Then we get another 6 electric vehicles. So what are we going to do now? We're going to have 12 cables running across the roof to get to these. Well, just to show you this idea around the flat cable, you install the flat cable once past every vehicle in one project. So you run one cable around the perimeter. It doesn't have to be on the back wall. It can still be on the roof in front of the car spaces. And then each of these electric vehicles hooks in and charges off that cable. At a certain point in time, you'll get more electric vehicles coming into the building. You're getting near the limit of how many vehicles can charge off one flat cable. So what do we do next? Just say the limit of electric vehicles that you can have charging off one flat cable is 20. Now we're at the point where we've got 20 electric vehicles charging in the building. What we do is we break the flat cable here, permanently break it, and turn it into 2 flat cables. And then you separately power each of the flat cables. And that way you can have 20 electric vehicles charging on that side, on that single flat cable, and another 20 on this side, on that flat cable with separate power source to each flat cable. So that's how you scale up with the flat cable. So obviously it was developed in Norway because they're the country that's now hit 85 or 90% of new vehicles being electric. So as I said, recently installed into zinc in Alexandria in Sydney at Garden Street in Alexandria. And it can be used indoor, outdoors. It lowers the cost of the last mile connection into EV charging and the labor time, and it can be put between rows of car spaces that are back to back as well. So it's just an idea to keep in mind. There'll be more versions of this product coming into the market, and Mirvac is putting it into their new developments now. Now let's just talk about Wi-Fi for the car parking areas. It's an expensive project. So anyone that's worked in a commercial building in the city knows it's expensive to run Wi-Fi through an entire floor of a commercial building. But a car park area is pretty much the same. We've seen people do it with these basic routers that look exactly like the one that's in my own kitchen. So it's probably cheaper if you do it this way, and then repeaters like this on the roof of the car park area. Now, if you're trying to build a business case for getting Wi-Fi through the car park area, it's actually easier than you might think. And that's because a lot of our underground basement car parks, people lose 3G or 4G reception when they drive in. Now, a lot of people these days now are talking on the phone through their cars while they're driving. And we noticed there was this behavior in Sydney where people turn up, they're talking to their friends on the phone, they get back to their apartment building, and then they actually drive into the driveway of the apartment building, but they don't go in past the barrier gate or the garage door. And they sit there for another 5 minutes completing the phone call with the person they're talking to before they use their garage remote to enter the car park area, knowing that they're about to lose reception as soon as they drive in. Well, that applies to every person who drives an ICE vehicle or an electric vehicle who's talking while they're driving and wants to sustain their phone call. Well, if you've got a Wi-Fi network in the basement car park of your apartment building, and you give the password out to everyone, whether they're an EV owner or an ICE vehicle owner, they can put that into their phone, and mobile phones can actually cross over from using the 3G, 4G network to using the Wi-Fi as you drive into the car park. And then you can actually sustain that mobile phone call as you drive to your car space and get out of your car and walk to the lift. So that's a value add for everyone in the building, regardless of whether they've got an EV or not. So the uses of Wi-Fi in the car park area are, you've got these emerging Wi-Fi connected charge points where the charge points themselves connect to Wi-Fi, automatically download updates from the internet into the charge point after they're physically installed. You've got Wi-Fi can be used by electric vehicles downloading updates into the cars. You've got mobile phones that from both electric vehicle owners and ICE vehicle owners that can be used to sustain phone calls as you enter into the car park area. The Wi-Fi connected charge points can also do their software load balancing for, at least a small number of vehicles without having to buy hardware load balancers. And then some other strata schemes that put in the Wi-Fi network started thinking, well, hang on, when we go to upgrade it to the next version of our security cameras, we can actually start using Wi-Fi connected security cameras, like people have heard of Google Nest and all that sort of thing. So that has multiple benefits to it, getting the Wi-Fi into the car park. So we're now going to have a look at some case studies. This is the Alted building at Potts Point. And to give you an idea, this is 165 car spaces. They've installed 6 new distribution boards into the car park area, each with 30 poles on them, so that technically every car space can have a pole in the future. They've installed cable trays past every car space. They've got EV box chargers, which is a European brand. They've got car chargers, dynamic load balancing system, which uses Wi-Fi and Zone Raspberry Pis to capture metering data at as little as 1 second and put it up into the Amazon Web Services. They've got the Wi-Fi connectivity to the EV box chargers. And there's one thing in the policy set up at this building that they're using. The owners corporation is actually subsidizing the cabled runs from the nearest distribution board, because they've only got 6 of them, to equalize that in an accounting process so that the cost of setting up a charger for each individual car space is exactly the same, regardless of the cable run length from the nearest distribution board. So that's an accounting overlay to make it completely equitable and fair. Yeah, so here's the cable tray running past the car spaces, EV box charger here. This is a load balancing system installed in the switch room. And that load balancing system can do circuit level load balancing. So for example, if you've got flat cables, that type of load balancing system could load balance like clusters of vehicles on one flat cable. But in this particular building, they decided to use the cable tray rather than the flat cable. Let's jump over to the Richmond building in Pyrmont, which was a recipient of assistance from the New South Wales government as a pilot site for EV charging in strata. It's got 106 car spaces. Now, one contentious issue has always been, if we put a charge point into 1 or 2 visitor car spaces, are we losing visitor car spaces? Well, one way to get around that problem is what this building did. They've got 12 car spaces. So if you put an EV charge point behind every visitor car space, then you've just solved the problem that you're not losing any visitor car spaces. You've just enabled every visitor car space to be EV, but they continue to be visitor car spaces for ICE vehicles as well. So yeah, that's something to learn from this building. First time we've seen that approach. Yeah, great work by Dale Cohen, who's been a long-term EV owner, first a Mitsubishi Outlander owner and then a Tesla Model S owner, and the secretary of that strata scheme that put 5 years of effort into getting every car space in the building enabled for EV charging. So here they've got 3 new distribution boards with 70 poles on each of them. That covers a pole for every car space that wants to charge in the future. They've got 10 Tesla Generation 3 charge points, which use the Wi-Fi connectivity and software load balancing. They've got 2 ChargeFox charge points with the core hardware load balancer, and they've got 3 networking boxes and Ethernet for Ethernet connectivity. And they've got an online booking system for the visitor spaces. There's a photo of one of the Tesla Generation 3 charge points there. Keep in mind, bollards, last minute, people often overlook. It costs this building an extra $10,000 for bollards to protect things like distribution boards from being hit by cars. So just to give you an idea what some of these things look like, they've got 3 levels of basement car park. So they've got this configuration on each of the 3 levels. So they've got the black box is the network connectivity box where the data cables come in from the charge points. The gray box is the distribution board, which has the poles for electricity feeds to the charge points. So the ChargeMate chargers use a data cable that connects into one of these. The Tesla charge points use the Wi-Fi to connect and talk to each other and do load balancing. And the model that you have with the Tesla charge points is you can have up to 6 of those charge points. They're all physically the same, whether they're a master or a slave is just a configuration. They're all physically the same charger. They connect in a group, and you can have up to 6 of them slowing down and speeding up within a defined capacity limit. So just to give you an idea, this is the Richmond load balancing architecture. So at the moment, they've got 100 amps, three-phase allocated to electric vehicle charging. And then that's broken at the moment so that they've got 50 amps for all the Tesla charge points, and they've got 50 amps for ChargeFox charge points. But over time in the future, they could change that. They could actually, say we want 75 amps for Tesla and 25 for ChargeFox, or vice versa. They're also extensible in that they've got 160 amp circuit pathways to the 3 distribution boards on each floor of the basement car park. So if they, at a future point in time, increase the capacity from the street into the building, say if they increased that capacity from the street by another 100 amps, then they could turn this to 200, and then they could go 100, 100, or 150, or so without having to install thicker cables from the main switch room down to the distribution boards on each of the 3 floors of the basement car park. So that's the overview of load balancing. And then they've also got 2 different EV billing and management systems. They've got the Tesla one and they've got the ChargeFox one. So Tesla's the largest charging network in Australia. ChargeFox is the second largest charging network in Australia. They've got both systems. They're not held to ransom by any particular vendor. And, different operating models, of course, for each of the billing and management systems. And then I'll just talk about another system, which is here in Sydney from EVSE. That's the Ocular, Explorer and CSIRO load balancing system. So research has been done with CSIRO to create an advanced load balancing system for managing the load of fleet or, strata apartment building EV charging. Ocular are Australian designed charge points as well. Explorer is an Australian developed EV charging billing and management software with load balancing capability. So you can connect, say, Ocular or Schneider EV chargers, which are OCPP 1.6J compatible, into a network using this load balancing system. And the R&D they did extended to where you've got a solar system on the roof connected to the common area meter. The system can actually detect when there's excess solar power being generated that's not immediately consumed in the building, and instead of exporting that back to the grid as feed-in, diverting that into electric vehicles, which is a better use of solar feed-in, as solar feed-in tariffs are getting smaller, down around 5 cents per kilowatt hour these days. So if you've got, say, a large building with 800 car spaces, for example, this is one of 3 levels in this building, quite a bit of planning needs to go into it. Where are your visitor car spaces? Which visitor car spaces are going to have bollards on them? Where are you going to put distribution boards? Where are your car share vehicles going to go? Are they going to be electric? Do they have easy cable runs, back to the distribution boards, etc.? So there are at least 7 apartment buildings in Sydney now that have solar-powered EV charging. This is the Genesis building in Meadowbank, developed by Sasco, which was the first one to do it, 30 kilowatt solar system on the roof of the apartment building. And this is a shared EV charger in the basement car park that during the day you can capture solar power into electric vehicles that are charging if it's not used somewhere else. To my knowledge, no one's done solar and battery EV charging in Sydney yet, but I'm sure that will come fairly shortly, because we've got a couple of buildings that now have solar and battery on the common areas. So we're just going to have a little chat about bylaws and end user agreements, and then we'll take a couple of questions, and then we'll have to wrap up. So as we mentioned earlier today, there was that article about the tenant with the EV who was blocked off, told the incorrect information that he needed to get a bylaw and needed to lobby his owner of his apartment to get a bylaw and have legal fees and all that to charge. That's incorrect. Section 117 of the New South Wales Strata Schemes Management Act allows contracts between a strata scheme and another party. And that can be, this is the mechanism for, say, renting out a storage locker to someone in an apartment building. That same mechanism can be used for, recovering EV charging from a general power outlet that doesn't involve any physical change to the building. If you're doing bylaws for visitor car parking spaces, you might put time frames like maximum 4 hours in there. If you're doing bylaws for individual lot car parking spaces, you might have minimum open charge point protocol 1.6J and above, or Tesla generation 3 and above charge points. Or some buildings like Altair might determine that everyone has to buy charge points from one supplier to ensure interoperability if they're doing that, and also to manage costs if, for example, the owner's corporation is doing that accounting overlay where they equalize the costs for each charge point install regardless of the length of the cable run. Some people are putting in bonds for uninstallation of the charge point and make good, like repaint, retouch up the concrete if it's damaged after you sell your apartment if the charge point's being uninstalled. Also think about from the owner's corporation perspective, if you are going to allow some people to start running these conduits along the roof of the basement car park in the early days before you invest in cable tray or flat cable later on, then you might actually want to pass a bylaw that makes the individual lot owner pay for that conduit, but the minute after they pay for it, it becomes the property of the owner's corporation. And that way the owner's corporation can't be held hostage by an early adopter who's run a conduit back to a distribution board. And the owner's corporation's then got the right, just at any point in time without having to negotiate with the individual EV owner, to lift the connection point and move it onto a new distribution board, or move that cable off conduit on the roof onto a cable tray, or transition them into a flat cable that gets installed later on. So a little bit of thinking about the future proofing and some smarter bylaws there. You might also want to put a cap on a charging speed at single phase 16 amps or single phase 32 amps in buildings that have less capacity available for EV charging. Think about a policy document for the lot owner who might be allowed to engage their own electrician to sign off on the install. And finally, I'll just mention earlier this week, Matt Keane announced up to $10 million co-funding to New South Wales strata buildings which have more than 100 car spaces, which are medium rise or high rise, for retrofit of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. My interpretation of that is it wouldn't count for the actual charge station costs. It would just be all the backbone costs that we've been talking about in the scenarios earlier tonight. So here we are, we're at the end. So let's just jump over and have a look at some questions that have come through. So Sean saying, my strata exec refused circulation of general info regarding EVs and charging, fearing this would indicate possible acceptance. Okay, so look, we have found this. Remember, strata schemes are the fourth tier of government. And if you buy into a strata scheme or you rent into a strata scheme, you've got to accept the rules of the house. So rather than thinking of it as, probably the better way to think about it is imagine you're a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. You want to lobby, the US government to make a policy change. What you have to do in strata is adopt that mindset. I live in strata. It's the fourth tier of government. I have to lobby. I have to influence. I have to do the education. I have to take other owners out for coffee and convince them of the merits of this if I'm an early adopter. So you can't force an owners corporation to do anything. And think of it this way. Some owners corporations will be left behind. Others will move ahead. And we'll actually see, as there are more electric vehicles out there, that actually just makes the valuation of the properties where you can charge electric vehicles higher. And the people that get left below, they'll end up having lower property valuations, and there'll be less desirable apartment buildings to live in. So that's the tip I would have there. Is it safe to use a GPO routinely for charging as opposed to a dedicated circuit with its own safety switch? Heaps of people in normal houses are using GPOs for charging routinely, and that's been going on for a number of years. So I can't comment on the quality of the electrical work in any particular strata building, but in the US market, for the last decade, people have been using general power outlets to charge their electric vehicles. What are the advantages and disadvantages of 6, 7, 8, and 9? How do you get to look at the zinc building, which seems to be a leader? So Nathan Haig has appeared in a few newspaper articles, and he's the person who spearheaded the work at the zinc building. We're happy to have been supporting Nathan, would you believe, over like a 4 or 5 year journey. Same way as we supported Dale Cohen from the Richmond building over a 5-year journey. So think about it. These are the people that actually started this process with their stratas 5 years ago, and we're running surveys, getting a pulse on EV charging and EV vehicle ownership in those buildings 5 years ago. So that's my tip is you have to be in there for the long haul, like the people like Dale Cohen from Richmond, like the people like Nathan Haig from Zinc, but they've broken down the barriers, and now it's actually much easier for anyone that's on this call or anyone that's trying to do it. It's not going to take you the 5 years that it took those early adopters. Again, the Altair building, it's a famous building because Jimmy Thompson from the Flat Chat column, who's dedicated to strata, he lives in that Altair building. So they've got switched on people at the Altair as well. And what we'll see now is it will just domino out through the rest of the buildings. Liz is saying, what option would be best for multiple caged car park spaces in a 100+ apartment complex? The flat cable looked good for open plan. Not sure about caged. Well, remember, the flat cable can actually run along the front of the cages. And, the other thing to look at is if you're going to do cable tray in the front of the cages, you've actually got to look and see how much clearance there is between the garage door cages when they're open and the rooftop. So either the flat cable or the cable tray, probably the thing that would dictate the decision there is, do you have a flat roof all the way along? If you start to have bumps in the roof and like this as you go along, then the flat cable's no good. You're going to be doing a cable tray installation there. Okay, examples 1 to 2 provide power for a few privileged people. Okay, so I think what Stephen's saying is the short-term solutions favor the few at the expense of the majority. But look, I think what I would say there is, think of it actually as those first people that took the risk of buying a more expensive vehicle than the people that are going to buy a cheaper electric vehicle later down the line. are actually doing the education process on the other people in the apartment block. Like after one person drives in with an electric vehicle in that building, it's interesting. Other people walk up to that person and say, "Hey, I saw your electric vehicle. I've finally decided I'm going to take one for a test drive this weekend." So, and nothing you do in the early days is really dictating what happens later on. What you're doing early on is you're actually just enabling something. Like the biggest problem is no strata buildings have enough money to do the whole shebang, the big bang, roll it all in one hit. So actually incrementalism is the way you win. Iterative processes is the way you win in strata. If you go out with the big bang approach, effectively you'll turn up to your EGM, you'll get shot down because you went out with something that was too bold and too audacious. You didn't bring people on the journey. So think again, you're a lobbyist in Washington, DC. You're, instead of lobbying the president, you're lobbying the fourth tier of government, which is your strata committee and all the owners in your strata building. So is it possible to install 5G repeaters in car parks? I'm sure that some of the Wi-Fi networks are 5G. A report today from Origin Arena, 30% of EV users charge during peak times. Origin saying the electricity system will collapse in 2030 if this continues. Okay, this is something that there's a person out there called a doomer, and we're going through an energy crisis at the moment. I'd actually ask people to have more trust in just the ingenuity of human beings to solve problems, and problems will be solved. And whether you're an Elon Musk fan or not, there'll be a way to convert the world from ICE vehicles to electric vehicles, which seemed impossible 10 years ago. There'll be a way for a private organization to launch rockets to the International Space Station. So try not to adopt doomer mentality, and try and remain positive and optimistic, because human beings in aggregate are intelligent enough to solve pretty much all the problems that will come in front of us on this journey. Let's have a look. Okay, I'm just looking. If you want an announcement on the New South Wales government co-funding, just go to Google. There was an article in The Guardian. It was also picked up in the Driven and a couple of other papers. So you just I think it was, the headline figure that you're looking for is 38 million, because they're also putting money into curbside charging in communities like Balmain that don't have that have on-street parking, and people can't charge their electric vehicles there either. And I think we're at the end of the questions. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining this webinar, which was part 2 of electric vehicles for Canada Bay. And thanks to both Jane Peacock, who started this program, and Belinda Coates, who's continued to sponsor it, for putting this on for the information of people in the local government area. So with that, thank you very much and good night.